Welcome to a presentation that will be the start of our Chapter 8 and 9 conversation. Since you're doing this as homework instead of in class, it'll be just a little bit different in that I'm not going to be giving you time to write stuff down. So what you should be doing when you come up to a slide and you have to take some notes, just pause the video real quick, get the notes that you need done, and then listen to my conversation about it. Chapter 8 and 9 deal with energy, how plants obtain energy, how animals obtain energy, and how really the whole process works. And we're actually going to start off this topic by me showing you a commercial. This is a very famous commercial that was done by Honda for a Super Bowl ad. So they spent a lot of time and a lot of money setting this up. So let's check this out, and I hope you enjoy it.
Isn't it nice when things just work?
So why did I show you that video, besides the fact that I think it's kind of cool? It's because that video did a really good job of illustrating how energy flows through a system, right? There were things that were up high that had some stored, what we call potential energy, gravitational potential energy, and then, when something bumped them, they fell down and then they hit something else, right? So that's an example of what we'd call gravitational potential energy being converted into then kinetic energy hitting something else. There were other examples where you had a battery, and the battery would have had some stored electrical energy, potential energy in there, and then it was used and converted into actual electrical energy. So it showed energy flowing through a system, and that's what we're going to be studying in this unit, is how does energy flow through living systems? Hopefully you remember these 8 characteristics of life from the first chapter of the year, and I told you that these would really be kind of guiding our conversation the rest of the year. In the last unit, we looked at made of one or more cells. In this unit, we're going to look at obtain and use energy. What does that look like for animals? What is the energy that they're going to be obtaining? How do they do so? And how does that energy actually utilize? What does it mean when I say that living things obtain and use energy? That's what we're going to wrestle with. And we're going to be studying how energy flows through living things. To give you an idea of what this looks like in living systems, let's look at this example of the guy who's lifting weights. I think you'll agree with me that he is expending energy, maybe a lot of energy lifting that weight, depending on how heavy it is. So the question is, the energy that he's using to push up those weights, where does that energy come from? So think about that for a minute. Where is the energy that he's burning, or he's using energy, where did he obtain it? Hopefully you realize that that energy that this man is using came from the food that he ate. And so then the logical question that follows that is, okay, well, where did this energy in the food come from? And if you think about that for a minute, where did the energy in this food come from? What you'll quickly realize is, well, it came from plants and animals. Whether we're talking about the cheese and the meat that came from a cow, or whether we're talking about the bread, or the potatoes, or the lettuce, or etc. All these different vegetables, all the energy that he's burning, he got as a heterotroph from consuming some other living thing. Now, go the next step. And the next step would be, where'd the cow get its energy from? Or, if we're talking about the plant, where'd the plant get its energy from? So whether we're looking at the meat and the cheese that came from the cow, or whether we're talking about the lettuce, etc., that came from some kind of plant, where did those things get their energy from? And the answer is the cow ate grass, so ultimately we end up getting back to plants, at least for terrestrial life, the kind of life that we're familiar with. And where do all those plants get their energy from? Well, ultimately they get it, of course, from the sun. So the reality is that for 99% of life on this planet, all the energy that is flowing through our system, whether it's a guy lifting weights or it's a cow walking around in the field, all that energy ultimately derives its origin from the sun. So hopefully that gives you an idea of the overall process of how energy flows through living systems. And what we're going to be wrestling with in this unit is realizing, okay, well, how do plants get energy from the sun and turn it into usable chemical energy that then all the other living things on this planet can utilize? There's a part of science that's actually a branch of physics called thermodynamics. And thermodynamics is the study of flow and the transformation of energy through some kind of system. And it can be a big picture through the entire universe. It could be in a solar system. It could be, whatever kind of level you want to look at. It could be an individual organism. What we're going to be studying with the thermodynamics that we're going to be interested in is through a couple of living organisms. So all life, 99% of life on this planet, the energy comes from the sun. The sun energy is captured in plants, if we're talking about terrestrial life, which is what we'll be looking at in this unit, through organelles called chloroplasts. So we'll be looking at what's happening in the chloroplasts in a process called photosynthesis that's going to use sunlight energy to ultimately produce a form of chemical energy, stored chemical energy called glucose. And that glucose is actually used by both plants and animals. Both of these have organelles called mitochondria, which are going to burn that sugar and produce a different kind of chemical energy, a very usable chemical energy called ATP. And that process, this part right here, that's going on here, is called cellular respiration. So we're studying really two different processes. We're going to be studying photosynthesis that turns light energy into sugar, and then we're going to be studying how that sugar is then turned into ATP through cellular respiration. So all living things obtain and use energy to carry out all of their biological processes. And whether that organism is obtaining the energy by eating plants or whether it's obtaining it by eating animals, all living things do this. Two chemical equations that you're going to need to get very familiar with are photosynthesis, the equation for photosynthesis, and cellular respiration. The nice thing is that these two equations are inverses of each other, which means that the reactants of one are the products of the other and vice versa. Let me explain. In photosynthesis, which occurs only in plant cells, because they're the ones that have the chloroplasts. Maybe make a little note of that we're talking about the chloroplasts here. In photosynthesis, water and carbon dioxide are used in the chloroplast to produce glucose and oxygen. And there's going to be one other, critical ingredient which will be going on in photosynthesis, and that, of course, is the sun. Right? We're going to need sunlight energy as well. And then in cellular respiration, which occurs in the mitochondria, and I'm not going to write that here, but you might want to write it down somewhere in here, mitochondria. Mitochondria in cellular respiration, glucose and oxygen are the reactants, and they're going to be burned and used to produce carbon dioxide and water and one other thing, which you might want to maybe draw, maybe come out of here. We're also going to be producing ATP. We'll look at what ATP is in just a second. It's important for you to understand that we're going to say that only plant cells can do this process, photosynthesis, but you need to understand that both plants and animals do this step. The key thing you need to remember is that plants and animal cells both have mitochondria, and they both carry out the same process of respiration, burning sugar in the presence of oxygen to produce ATP. The question is, where do these organisms get their sugar from? For plants, they can produce their own sugar using their chloroplasts. For animals, they cannot because they don't have chloroplasts, so they have to obtain their sugar from what they eat. But they're both going to be burning sugar the same way. The question is, where do they get it from? So this is kind of a written description of what we just talked about, the idea that sunlight energy is transformed into sugar by the chloroplasts. You might want to make a little note to yourself that, photosynthesis. And then it's transformed into ATP by the mitochondria. Maybe you want to make a little note to yourself that that is, of course, the cellular respiration part. And that happens in both plants and animals. Before you pause here and start taking your notes, there's one thing I need to point out to you. There's a mistake on this slide. This arrow, I don't know why it's up there. This arrow should be pointing right to here, right to the ATP. So go ahead and pause the video and make these notes with that arrow going there. All right, I'm assuming you've already done that. So I like this picture quite a bit because it shows us the overall process. You have light energy going in the chloroplast where photosynthesis is going to be happening. It's going to be taking carbon dioxide and water and producing. It says organic molecules. You may just want to make a note to yourself. This is from a college textbook for our class. I just want you to make a little note here that this is really sugar. It's going to be making sugar and oxygen. And then those are going to be burned in the mitochondria using a process called cellular respiration, producing CO2 and H2 as a byproduct, which go back into sort of this cycle, and also producing ATP, which is the chemical energy that cells actually use to do things. So I've mentioned this term ATP a few times. Let's talk about what it actually is. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. It is the most important biological energy molecule for living things on this planet. When you look at it, the term adenosine triphosphate, if we understand what that means, this region right here is an adenosine molecule, okay? And you'll learn in your biochemistry class that it's similar to an adenine, which is used in DNA and all that kind of stuff. And it really isn't important for my class. The important part of this molecule that you understand for my class is the triphosphate part. And if you think about what tri means, like a tricycle, tri means three. It's got 3 phosphate groups on it, which is what we're seeing here. So when you see the P with the O's around it, we're looking at phosphate groups. And what's interesting about this molecule is that there's energy stored in the bonds that are holding these phosphate molecules together. And so by breaking and forming those bonds, we can release energy and we can use energy to build it. And so that's what we're going to see is essentially the function of this molecule. So we have another picture that kind of illustrates that we've got adenosine triphosphate. Here's the adenosine part. Here's the triphosphates. If you think about it, what would it be called, do you think, if it didn't have this phosphate? Let's pretend that phosphate's gone. What would the molecule be called then? Well, it's going to be, what we're going to see is that it's called adenosine diphosphate because it would just have 2 if this one was gone. So what this slide is showing us is what it says, that the breakdown of ATP releases energy. Remember, there's energy stored in the bonds that are holding those phosphates to the ATP molecule. So if you snap one off, if I were to snap a phosphate off of ATP, what would it become? Well, it would become, as we just mentioned, adenosine diphosphate, right? ADP. Because it would have lost one of the 3, so it goes from 3 to 2, so it goes from ATP to ADP. Plus a free phosphate, because that phosphate that got broken off, it doesn't just disappear. It's now just free floating. So we call it a free phosphate group. And that releases energy. So the breakdown of ATP to ADP results in energy being released and a free phosphate group being released. That's what this diagram is showing us. If you look here, just try to follow me here, you've got ATP, adenosine triphosphate, that's that molecule. I told you there's energy stored in the bonds that are holding these phosphate groups to it. If it breaks down, if one of these phosphate comes off of it, well, you're going to have ADP, adenosine diphosphate, plus that free phosphate that's now off by itself, and energy gets released, and that energy can be used to allow the cell to do certain things. Now notice that there's also this arrow going up. What's up with that? Well, what we're going to see in this unit, how do you make ATP? Well, think about it. What do you need in order to build ATP? Well, you need at least an ADP molecule plus a phosphate we're going to stick on. And to stick that on is also going to require some energy. So what we'll see later on is that to make ATP, we're going to take an ADP molecule and a phosphate molecule and some energy to drive that formation of ATP. And then that energy is not gone. It's now stored in this molecule, which can be used to to do things, as it's showing here. I've shown you this picture before. This was from last chapter. You got the microtubule, you have a vesicle being carried along that microtubule by that little motor protein looking guy that's kind of taking his little steps. And I told you that every step of that protein is requiring a molecule of ATP. So in the picture they're just showing the ATP going in, but now we know what's really happening is that ATP is breaking down, a phosphate's being released, ADP is what we have now, and the energy that's being released there is used to actually drive that motor protein a step forward. Now, if you think about that for a minute, if every little step that motor protein is taking requires ATP, then the cell really must be using an astonishing amount of ATP. Right? I mean, this is just one cellular function, and every little step is going to take ATP, so the cell must be using a lot of this cellular energy molecule, and in fact, that's true. Cells do use a tremendous amount of this, but they can also produce a lot of it from sugar in cellular respiration. We'll be learning about that in this unit. This we're going to go through really quickly because this is something that we've already learned. Metabolism, this is from chapter 1. Metabolism is all of the chemical reactions occurring in an organism, but those are broken down into two different types. You have anabolism and catabolism. Anabolism is when we are building large molecules from smaller molecules. Catabolism, remember that word, think of cut. To do catabolism is to cut or break down large molecules into smaller ones. Now, I want you to make a little note somewhere on your study guide where you took these notes that anabolism, photosynthesis, is an anabolic process. And if you look at the equation back on page 1, you'll see why. We're going to take two small molecules, carbon dioxide and water, and we're going to build a much larger molecule, glucose, which is C6H12O6, bigger molecule. And also make a note to yourself that catabolism, cellular respiration, is catabolic. Cellular respiration, we're going to take a large glucose molecule in the presence of oxygen, and we're going to break it down into smaller molecules, carbon dioxide and H2O. So we're going to see how those two terms that we've been looking at earlier in the year now apply to what we're talking about this year, this unit. We've also learned these two terms, autotroph and heterotroph. We know that autotrophs are organisms that can feed themselves. They're self-feeders. Heterotrophs, on the other hand, have to eat some other living organism in order to survive. In this unit, we're going to figure out, how does that actually work? How do autotrophs feed themselves through the process of photosynthesis? So if you look at this picture, we have our autotroph, the plant, which is feeding itself through the process of photosynthesis using solar energy. And then we have our heterotroph, our little bug on here that's eating the plant. So real quick, let's run through a few examples of some autotrophic organisms. This here is a picture of a leaf, all green plants. Anywhere you see that color green, I want you to be thinking photosynthesis, because we'll learn actually the first lecture next week why it is that plants are green. And it's because they have this amazing molecule chlorophyll, which is absorbing the solar energy and is a critical part of photosynthesis. All the flowering plants are autotrophs as well. Kind of a cool picture here of a tree in the background with some other plants through a droplet of water that's attached to the tree. Really famous autotroph here. This is the really large fig tree, which is in Balboa Park. You might have seen it. It's right near the Natural History Museum. Really gigantic tree. Another picture of it, kind of looking at the base of it. And one last picture of it, you can see a person in the picture for scale. That's the Natural History Museum in the background. So all of these are autotrophs. This grass is autotroph. Anywhere you see green, remember, think photosynthesis. The kelp that we have growing off of the coast of California that breaks off and of its hold fast and then washes into shore, washes along the beaches, and kind of looks gross to everybody. The kelp forests, these plants, these are autotrophs. They're producing their own energy. They're the basis of the food chain in that amazing biodiverse kelp forest that we have off our coast. And it's in other parts of the world as well. Bristlecone pine, interesting. This is the oldest living thing on the planet as far as the amount of years that it can live as plants. It's in California. It's in the mountains of California, and they can grow to really astonishing years old. And they calculate those ages by looking at the tree rings. All of this, green slime that you'll see different places. Sometimes, if you see it in, rivers and stuff, it might be moss or algae. It could also be photosynthesizing cyanobacteria. So take these notes. These will be the last of your notes for this video. You'll finish at page 1 and 2 only during this video. This won't be on your exam per se, but I wanted to show it to you so that you could see the amazing diversity we have of autotrophs. Because the only ones we're going to talk about really in this class are the vascular plants, which is a small subsection of the plants on this planet. But they're all doing photosynthesis. We'll learn how they carry that out using their chloroplasts. But these organisms do similar things as a unicellular protist. So there's actually an animal cell. You can see the flagella right there. I did tell you that there are in fact some animal cells that can do photosynthesis using chloroplasts. This would be an example. Multicellular algae, unicellular bacteria, so cyanobacteria, and then the purple sulfur bacteria. Now these are interesting. So the green ones are doing photosynthesis. These purple ones, though, when you see purple, that's not photosynthesis. What these guys are doing, these are kind of the exceptions to the rule. 99% of life on this planet derives its energy from the sun. These guys can actually derive their energy doing a different process called chemosynthesis, not photosynthesis. They're not using light. They use sulfur-containing compounds, and they're able to synthesize glucose chemically that way. We're not going to talk about how they do that in my class, but just want to introduce it to you. These are the ones that are powering life in some special parts on the planet, like at the bottom of the oceans where you have hydrothermal vents, or in some cave ecosystems. So they're really the exception to the rule, but kind of cool to look at and think about. Let's look at some pictures of heterotrophs. So what we're essentially looking at is pictures of things eating other living things. So you got a bird eating a fish, another cool picture of a bird eating a fish, another bird eating a fish, a caterpillar eating a leaf. You kind of notice making this sort of circular pattern. There's actually one real kind of fun fact here. There's actually a species of cricket that what it does is, the crickets, the males chirp. It's that annoying noise that keeps you up at night sometimes. That chirping is actually used to attract the females. There's some male crickets that will actually cut a small hole in a leaf and then bend the leaf around, almost making kind of like a megaphone, and then when they chirp, it amplifies that sound and makes them sound like a bigger cricket, a real, macho male that the females will want to mate with. Kind of a sad picture there of a snake eating a frog. This is cool. This is what's called a sun spider eating a bee. Bees are attracted to flowers through interesting ways, not just the color that we can see, but also through color that we can't see, the actual reflection of the ultraviolet light from the sun. Now, we can't detect that, but bee eyes can. So this bee to our eyes looks white, but actually to the bee it's more visible because what happens is this coloration actually reflects the ultraviolet light really well, and so what happens is the bee is attracted to that color pattern because it thinks, wow, this is a really awesome flower to go pollinate, or to go, get nectar from or whatever. And in the process, as it gets closer, the sun spider gets an easy meal. Shark eating a baby seal. Killer whale doing the same. Frog going after a cricket. These are all heterotrophs. Yeah, heterotrophs. This is a cool picture here. This is a killer whale hunting gray whale. They're called killer whales because they kill whales. They're actually not whales themselves. They're closely related to dolphins. You see that little picture in the background? That's an octopus. That's a watermark that somebody put on this picture because they didn't want somebody taking it off their website. But I did anyway because I wanted to use it in my class. An amoeba. On a microscopic level, things are eating each other. So I'm going to show you a video on this next slide of an amoeba eating a little paramecium. Let's check this out. So as you watch this, notice it says endocytosis. We know what that is. So what we have here, there's the amoeba. This whole thing is the amoeba. There's a little guy, a little unicellular organism that it's going to eat. So it's going to do endocytosis. So notice that little unicellular organism is not moving. It's not aware that the amoeba is there because the amoeba is sort of surrounding it. It's going to pinch it off into a little vesicle, which is endocytosis, which is accomplished now. And now it's going to start to digest it. So we're going to have lysosomes fusing with it. It's going to start to digest it. It's going to realize that it's being eaten, and it's going to panic and try to get out, but it can't. It's being digested. It's, and then right there about now, it's dead. It's going to be fully digested and eaten by this heterotrophic amoeba. So even on a microscopic level, we have both autotrophs and heterotrophs. And the most common, ones that we think about are the complex animals that we see, whether it's a mammal, a bird, amphibian, an insect. These are the types of organisms that we think of that are heterotrophs, these ones that we're familiar with. Some organisms actually get the color that they appear from the things that they eat. So flamingos are classic examples of this. They're heterotrophs. They eat shrimp and things like that, and they have this coloration to them, and they take that pigment and put it in their own feathers and get that pink color. Some organisms are a certain color because they're poisonous. So like this is a caterpillar for a monarch butterfly, and it's eating milkweed, which has toxins in it. It's able to sort of store those toxins in its own tissues, and it gets that bright aposematic coloration as a result. The adults have that same coloration. We've learned about aposematic coloration already. And of course, let's not forget about the most menacing of all heterotrophs. So think about for a minute, what would that be? The organism on the planet that's a heterotroph and eats the biggest diversity of things. Well, that would actually be human beings. It's not even close. Humans, because we're all over the planet and we have such a varied diet, we eat all sorts of things. This, of course, is the picture of Kobayashi, but he's replaced by this guy. I forget what his name is, but he's the new champ, as far as I know, of the hot dog eating contest. So that's the end of this video. We're done with pages 1 and 2 of your study guide. The next time I see you, we will continue on with page 3 and 4. Have a nice day.